going to cover the functions of the respiratory system, which I hope you already know, as well as the upper respiratory tract. All of these structures should look familiar, or if they don't, they will by the end of this section. There are multiple processes involved in respiration, which are going to include pulmonary ventilation, fancy way about talking about breathing, external respiration, which is the exchange of gases between lungs and blood, transportation, which means we're moving either oxygen or carbon dioxide around, and internal respiration, which involves gas exchange between systemic blood vessels and the tissues in the periphery. When we talk about the circulatory system, we are talking about the transportation of gases as well as internal respiration. When we talk about the respiratory system, we are specifically and only talking about pulmonary ventilation, breathing, and external respiration, which is the exchange of gases between blood and the lungs. We know that cellular respiration is required by more advanced organisms to produce enough ATP to continue to function and live. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct. Only pulmonary ventilation and external respiration are included in the respiratory system. Please remember that forever, not just for this class. The major function of respiration should be a gimme. Its job is to supply the body with sufficient amounts of oxygen for cellular respiration. The respiratory system is going to have a massive amount of surface area for gas exchange with blood. And we know that we will be moving gases to and from the exchange surfaces of the lungs into the blood. The respiratory system will also include olfaction, our ability to scent things, and our ability to speak because of the vocal cords. In addition, the respiratory system does protect respiratory surfaces from becoming dehydrated, temperature changes, as well as other things that might happen in the environment in order to protect the lungs, and also protection against pathogens. Major organs are listed here, and we are going to go over each and every one of those. This gives you a diagram of those structures and where they sit in the body. And let's jump in. Now, interestingly, we do lose water as we breathe, up to 17.5 milliliters, about 0.6 fluid ounces of water per hour. And clearly, when you're exercising, you're going to increase that amount to about 4 times that volume. The upper respiratory organs will all be lined with mucous membranes, which includes epithelial tissue as well as underlying connective tissues, and we will have many goblet cells. Now think back to the histology portion of your previous course, 131, if you took it at TC3. You will remember when we talked about epithelial cells or epithelial tissues, there were several types of columnar epithelial cells which had goblet cells, and the job of those goblet cells is to produce mucus. The upper respiratory organs are there to help warm and moisten incoming air. And that mucus, oh joy, mucus. That mucus is going to be really important because of the mucociliary escalator. So we know that mucus is going to trap debris, and that cilia is going to move that debris to the pharynx, which means that that mucus and whatever it has collected is going to be swallowed, destroyed by enzymes and by the acidity of the stomach, and basically pass harmlessly out with fecal matter. The nose is our first and most obvious respiratory structure. We know that it provides a pathway for air to enter. It does warm and moisten air that's entering the respiratory tract. It is also going to filter and therefore clean that air that you're breathing in. You're going to have nose hairs that will help trap particles to keep them from going down into your lungs. The nose also helps you with voice resonance, and it is also going to house the olfactory receptors. It has two regions, the external nose and the nasal cavity. The external nose is what we see, and all the parts are listed there. The philtrum is that little shallow vertical groove that's going to be inferior to the apex, and the nostrils, also known as nares, are going to be bounded laterally by ala. You can see the frontal bone in those pictures. The epicranius is going to be located there. Nasal bone, cartilage, the maxillary bone. And the nose will also contain dense fibrous connective tissue and various cartilage. Interestingly, the nares have different shapes. Who knew? You do now. And I put this in there because it really is quite amazing how different those nostrils can look. We know that the nasal cavity is going to warm and moisten the air that you breathe in. Within the posterior part of the nose, you have the nasal cavity that is going to be divided at the midline by the nasal septum. And again, you remember that septum means wall. There will be posterior nasal apertures, which are going to open to the nasopharynx. The roof is going to be the ethmoid and sphenoid bones, and the floor will be both the hard and soft palates. And we'll talk more about the hard and soft palates when we get to the digestive system. You will also see in that diagram the opening of the pharyngeotympanic tube, the more clinical term or anatomical term for the eustachian tube, which leads off to the ear. The nasal vestibule is going to be superior to the nostrils. It is going to contain hairs. I will not expect you to be able to pronounce or say vibrissae, and the job of those are to filter coarse particles from the air that you're breathing in. The rest of the nasal cavity is going to be lined with those mucous membranes, which include the respiratory mucosa and the olfactory mucosa. So what are the functions in a nutshell? What are the functions of the nasal cavity? Respiration, keeping the inhaled air humidified, and removing particles, which includes dust. Let's talk about the olfactory epithelium. In a minute. The respiratory mucosa is, what a surprise, if you remember this from your histology days, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. It will secrete mucus, it will have serous secretions, those will contain lysosomes and defensins, part of the immune system. The cilia is going to sweep any contaminated mucus back into the throat, and we know that the air that you're breathing in is going to be warmed, and that's going to happen because there are going to be these network or plexuses of capillaries and veins that are quite superficial in the nasal mucosa. Also, you're going to have sensory nerve endings there, and those are what are stimulated when you sneeze, or which cause you to sneeze when stimulated. So I need to change the title on this, and I will. Okay, so the cilia, we know, is going to move contaminated mucus back to the throat. We know that the inspired air is going to be warmed by plexuses of capillaries and veins, and we know we're going to have sensory nerve endings there. Now, here we go with the olfactory mucosa. Fascinating, isn't it? So if you take a look at the diagram of the nasal cavity on the right, you can see that the olfactory mucosa is labeled, and it says olfactory tract, but actually, to be technically correct, that is the olfactory nerve, because you will remember that tracts are found within the central nervous system, and the olfactory nerve is a cranial nerve, which tells you right off the bat that that's part of the peripheral nervous system. So that's going to be the cranial nerve. That is cranial nerve. Anybody remember? Cranial nerve 1. Cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve. And then you see a blow up of what the olfactory epithelium looks like, which is pretty cool and pretty complex. I will not put the diagram like this on the test and say, name these. I do want you to know that there is olfactory mucosa within the nasal cavity, however. Now, we've already talked about the respiratory mucosa. This gives you some images of that, and there's a good video there, so you can watch that. A little bit of a repeat. We also have nasal conchae within the nose. So take a look at the diagram on the bottom. You see those sort of wing-like projections there? Those are the nasal conchae, and they are going to be basically sticking out medially from the lateral walls. And they are going to split the nasal cavity into these sort of groove-like passages, which have several functions. One, they are going to provide increased surface area for the mucous membrane, which means that more particles will be trapped from the air that you breathe in. And it also provides more ability to warm that air before it actually hits the rest of the respiratory tract. And it's going to do that because when the air hits those wave-like or groove-like passages, you're going to have more air turbulence. So the nasal conchae actually act together to help warm, moisten, and filter air pretty efficiently. Now, the paranasal sinuses. You need to know about these, okay? These ones specifically, which are marked there. The frontal sinuses, remember they're bilateral. The sphenoid sinuses, the ethmoid sinuses, and the maxillary sinuses. Now, truth be told, people don't really know why we have sinuses. And we actually have more than the ones that are listed here. But these are the ones you need to know when you're talking about the respiratory tract. The best guess is that they help lighten the skull, they aid with voice resonance, and they also help warm and moisten air. Now, if you have ever had a sinus infection, this is what happens. Oh, and it's so painful because I get them from time to time. You have sinusitis, yikes. Bacteria gets into your a sinus, and it is a really great place for a bacteria to live because it's warm and it's moist and it's protected. And what happens is those bacteria begin to reproduce, and they are excreting waste. And that waste, that debris, actually clogs up the tiny little entrances into, or egresses out of the sinus. And meanwhile, the bacteria are using up the oxygen in your sinus, so you end up with a vacuum in your head, which is why they are so unbelievably painful. Not fun. Now, rhinitis is the common cold, which can also have similar symptoms to when you're having an allergy or an allergic reaction. What happens? Your nasal mucosa becomes inflamed. That nasal mucosa is going to be continuous with the mucosa of the rest of the respiratory tract, so that will spread from the nose down into the throat, down into the chest, which is why if you end up with the sniffles, you might end up with a chest cold. It also may or will spread to your tear ducts and your paranasal sinuses, which means what we just talked about: blocked sinus passageways, air absorbed, vacuum in your head, and a sinus headache. Totally not fun. Once you leave the nasal cavity, you are moving air into the pharynx, which is basically a muscular tube that's going to start at the base of the skull and extend down to the level of about C6. It connects the nasal cavity and the mouth to both the larynx and the esophagus. It's composed of skeletal muscle, and it is a passageway through which we move both food and air. There are three regions: the nasopharynx, which is posterior to the nasal cavity, the oropharynx, which is posterior to the mouth, and the laryngopharynx, which is going to be associated with, what a surprise, the larynx. So we know that the nasopharynx is going to be posterior to the nasal cavity. It is lined by pseudostratified columnar epithelium. The soft palate and the uvula close off the nasopharynx while you are swallowing. It will contain pharyngeal tonsils, also known as the adenoids, on the posterior wall, and the auditory or eustachian tubes will drain into and equalize the pressure of the middle ear. They're going to drain into the nasopharynx and help equalize the pressure in the middle ear, because we saw the opening in the lateral walls there. The eustachian tube is technically and anatomically more correctly called the pharyngeotympanic tube, but eustachian tube works too. Now, take a look at this. When you see an infant's eustachian tube, it looks relatively flat because the child's skull bones are still growing. And as they grow and develop, the eustachian tube gets a greater angle or slant down into the nasopharynx. And this, my friends, is why children end up with ear infections or otitis media. Because if you take a look at that tube, it's so easy for bacteria that is in the nasal passage to move, or the nasopharynx to move up that relatively flat tube into the middle ear. And what a surprise, what a great place to start to set up shop and start to replicate that warm, moist, lovely inner ear. If you take a look at the adult angle, you can see that it's much greater than the one in the child, and that allows for draining, and it also makes it harder for bacteria to move up in that direction to get to your inner ear, or sorry, your middle ear, which means adults are less likely to get otitis media. Otitis media, right? Ear infection. There's a good little video there. Inferior to the nasopharynx is the oropharynx, which is a passageway for food and air, and it extends from the level of the soft palate down to the epiglottis. It has a stratified squamous epithelial lining. There are a couple of landmarks: the isthmus of Fauces, which is the opening to the oral cavity. The palatine and lingual tonsils are you can see those on some of the diagrams we have here. And anytime you hear tonsils, think immune system. Now, laryngopharynx is also a passageway for food and air. That's what the pharynx does. It is posterior to the epiglottis, which sits upright. It extends down to the larynx, and the larynx is going to be continuous with the esophagus too. It is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. So let's take a look at this. Larynx is going to attach to the hyoid bone. It does open superiorly to the laryngopharynx, which is going to be also continuous with the trachea. Its functions is to provide what's known as a patent airway. It is going to route air and food off to the proper channels, theoretically air down the trachea and food down the esophagus. And it's also going to be important because, excuse me, it houses the vocal folds. So it is required for the production of speech. The trachea is inferior to that. And we're going to talk about the functionality of the hyaline cartilage that is part of these structures in a minute. There are 9 cartilage pieces that form the larynx. They are all hyaline except for the epiglottis. There is a thyroid cartilage with the laryngeal prominence, the so-called Adam's apple. There is the cricoid cartilage, which is attached to the first ring of the trachea. Why is this important? Clinically, it's very important because it is the site of a tracheostomy. There are going to be several paired cartilages, the arytenoid, the cuneiform, and the corniculate cartilage. The epiglottis itself is not hyaline cartilage, it is elastic cartilage, and it is going to cover the laryngeal inlet as you swallow. And actually, it does have taste buds in the mucosa that cover it. Kind of cool. This shows you an up close and personal of each of those. Now, let's talk about voice production. The vocal ligaments, wahoo, are going to be deep to that laryngeal mucosa. There are upper vestibular folds, which are the so-called false vocal cords. The vocal ligaments will attach the arytenoid cartilage to the thyroid cartilage. They're going to contain elastic fibers. That's going to be important. And they will form the core of the true vocal cords, which are known as the vocal folds. The glottis is actually the opening between the vocal folds. And those folds are going to vibrate to produce sound as air moves up and out of the lungs. And this shows you what's happening when the vocal folds are open and when the vocal folds are closed. There's a video that is posted at the bottom there. The link is posted at the bottom there. Please watch that and make sure you know what happens. So there are the vestibular folds, the so-called false vocal cords, which are going to be superior to the vocal folds. They do not play a role in sound production, and they do help close the glottis as you swallow. Now, we know that sounds are going to originate from the vibration of vocal folds. Other structures are actually going to take that sound and convert it into recognizable speech. They will include the pharynx, the mouth, and the tongue, the nasal cavity, and the paranasal sinuses. And this is actually a pretty cool little video, how do vocal cords work when you sing. Watch that because the singer, the woman, uses different pitches and you can see the changes to her vocal folds. It's fascinating and totally cool. So when it comes to voice production, this is what happens. You have what's known as speech intermittent release of expired air while the glottis is opening and closing. The pitch will be determined by both the length and the tension of those vocal cords. The loudness depends upon the force of air. So if you want to project your voice, you want to sound louder, you're going to be pushing more air out. We know that the pharynx, oral, nasal, and sinus cavities will help amplify and enhance sound quality. And the sound is shaped or formed into language by muscles of the pharynx, the tongue, as well as the soft palate and the lips. So the vocal folds may actually act as sphincters to help prevent air passage. And an example of that is Valsalva's maneuver, which is you hold your breath and you bear down like you are defecating. What happens is the glottis closes, so you do not exhale. The abdominal muscles will contract. The intra-abdominal pressure rises, and that is going to help empty the rectum or stabilize the trunk during heavy lifting. Or in my case, because I have supraventricular tachycardia, when I'm having an episode of that, I do Valsalva's movement, which, as we just said, you hold your breath and you bear down like you're defecating. And that generally stops the tachycardic episode. It has all but once. So the epithelium of the larynx is going to vary depending on where you are. Superior portion is going to be stratified squamous epithelium. The inferior portion, that's going to be inferior to the vocal folds, will be our friend, the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And we're going to end here for now because we will tackle what happens inferior to the larynx in the next segment.